Tonight on Closer Look, a longtime tenant can stay in her home despite a landlord's attempt to evict her for personal use reasons. Toronto Today reporter Gabe Oatley covered the story of Victoria MacDonald and her dispute with her landlord and joins us tonight from Toronto. Gabe, MacDonald has spent nearly 50 years in the same apartment, and then out of the blue almost 2 years ago, she was asked to vacate her home, which was followed by the landlord filing an N12 eviction. We've heard a fair bit about these N12s, also referred to as own use or personal use eviction, but maybe as a refresher, explain what it is and how they work.
Yeah, totally. So folks have probably heard lots about renovictions. This is when a landlord says they are going to renovate the unit and kick someone out as a result. This is a distinct, different category of evictions that landlords can use to get tenants out of the unit. This is referred to colloquially as a personal use eviction or an own use eviction, as you said. And this is a type of eviction that allows a landlord to force a tenant to vacate if the owner or a family member or a caregiver wants to move into that unit and stay for at least 1 year. So Scott, say if you had a house and you rented out your basement apartment and a child of yours was coming back from university and needed a place to stay and you wanted to move your kid into your tenanted basement apartment, the law would allow you likely to do that. So personal use evictions are absolutely allowed under the law, but we've seen a pretty dramatic increase in the use of these sorts of evictions of late, and tenant advocates have said that landlords are using these sorts of evictions to inappropriately kick people out. So there have certainly been cases we've seen where landlords have kicked someone out using an N12 and then either immediately relisted that apartment at a higher rent price, or have moved a family member in only temporarily and then subsequently, a month later, relisted the place.
All right, that's great context. Thanks for that, Gabe. So this obviously a very stressful time for Victoria MacDonald. She told you the story that she's been sober for over 20 years, but the threat of the eviction almost pushed her to drink. Now, instead, she chose an AA meeting, which led to a chance meeting. Can you tell us about that meeting?
Totally. Yeah. So Victoria is in her 70s. She has been sober, she said, for more than 20 years. She's lived in her 2-bedroom, 3rd-floor apartment in Toronto for, as you said, nearly 50 years, which is like a time frame that I struggle to comprehend, as a 35-year-old, like living somewhere for 50 years. That's a long time. She said she has had a really good experience in her building, generally good relations with the landlord, both past landlord and current landlord. But as you said, 2 summers ago, she got an email from a guy who works for her landlord telling her of the need to terminate her lease agreement. It said that the landlord's son would be moving into her unit. Understandably, Scott, she was really distressed. I met with her in her apartment on the day that the adjudicator issued her decision. And she said that the same sort of powerful forces that came up that used to push her to drink came up again after she got that email. But she said that rather than drinking, she did something she knew she should do. She went to that AA meeting, and it was there that she started telling folks about her concerns. And she said a bit of a miracle happened. Somebody in the group told her that she should contact the Parkdale Neighborhood Legal Clinic and potentially try and fight the eviction. And she ultimately did. And I think it's safe to say things have turned out very differently than they could have otherwise had she not gone to that meeting.
Yeah, no question. Okay, so a week ago, an adjudicator with the Landlord and Tenant Board Tribunal decided Victoria's allowed to stay indefinitely, tossing an application brought by her landlord. What was her reaction?
She was jubilant. So I went over to her apartment that day. There were some of her neighbors crossing over in the hallway. They were celebrating together. One gave her a gift. It was like a really, celebratory moment. But she said when we chatted about it that it really has not been an easy ride for the past 2 years. This eviction threat has really hung over her head. Ultimately, the adjudicator tossed the application on pretty straightforward grounds. So individual landlords are allowed to issue N12 own use evictions, but corporate landlords are not allowed to use these sorts of evictions. Victoria's building is owned by a company called South Ontario Investments Limited. And quite simply, the adjudicator said, companies can't issue N12s. Victoria's lawyers had a bunch of other evidence that they were going to introduce had it gotten to that stage in the hearing, which they said they believe shows that it wasn't sort of a good faith eviction. For instance, this past summer, a unit, right underneath Victoria's, nearly identical in layout, came available. At that time, Victoria's lawyers emailed the landlord's paralegal saying, hey, this is great news. This means Victoria won't have to leave her unit because the son can just move into the vacant unit. The paralegal at that time, though, said, this is not amenable to my clients. We're still going to move forward with this N12. So ultimately, none of that needed to be introduced because the adjudicator, decided quite simply corporate landlords can't use N12s.
All right. Now, Victoria isn't the only one who's been threatened with personal use evictions in recent years. Gabe, what does the data tell us about the trend line on these sorts of evictions?
Yeah, it shows us it's going up. So from 2020 to 2023, the number of N12s filed with the Landlord and Tenant Board increased by 85%. So in 2020, about 3,500 N12s were applications were submitted to the LTB for, desired evictions province-wide. And in 2020, that number increased to about 6,400. So 3,500 to 6,400 over a 3-year period. I spoke with a lawyer at the Parkdale Neighborhood Legal Clinic, and his position is that, bad faith, good faith, these N12s shouldn't be allowed under the law at all. His position was that they are unfair for tenants and show sort of a real hierarchy in whose needs are prioritized under the law. His argument being that landlords' needs are really prioritized as opposed to tenant needs. I'm sure landlord advocates would argue the exact opposite of that. But separately, as it relates to bad faith evictions, he also noted that their legal clinic has seen the use of N12s particularly target tenants who have been in their apartments for a long period of time, whose rent has been rent controlled. So in Victoria's case, she currently pays about $1,100 for her 2-bedroom apartment in Toronto. It's like a good price. And last summer, when the one nearly identical to hers was posted for rent, it was advertised at $2,300, so more than double. So tenant advocates strongly argue that a lot of these N12s are being filed for inappropriately in order for landlords to be able to break the leases with these tenants with whom they have, really affordable rent in order to sort of shift to, significantly higher rent.
All right, let's just get back to the LTB ruling for a sec. The landlord's paralegal has now hinted at a continued challenge to the decision. How likely is it that this case could be overturned on appeal, and what grounds might they argue?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the landlord's paralegal sort of firmly argued that under the law, there have been other cases where the Landlord and Tenant Board Tribunal has allowed corporations to use N12s when the corporation is closely held. So her argument was that the company that owns the apartment that Victoria lives in, yes, it's a corporation, but her framing was like, this is kind of more of a mom and pop type situation. The corporation is owned by, or it's directed by a mom and her daughter. So in her estimation, she thought this should be allowed because she said, yes, it's true, and 12s are not generally allowed for corporations, but this is sort of a special case that the law does allow for. The adjudicator in the case firmly disagreed, and it is, not clear whether or not under the law this is allowed. We looked at sort of the the outline that the LTV provides about whether or not corporations are allowed to use this, and it seems pretty clear that they're not. So, in terms of precedent, I'm not sure that this will create much more, other than perhaps a reminder for corporate landlords that they can't use N12s.
Toronto Today reporter Gabe Oatley on tonight's Closer Look.